Welcome to Houston Baptist University. We're very glad that you're all here. You're in for a treat today and tomorrow. We've been looking forward to this event for quite some time. If you would look to your brochure, it's got a schedule in there. We're going to be following that as closely as we can. I also wanted to point out there's a Walker Percy, a documentary film. It's free, and it's Friday tonight at 8:30, so if you finish and you would like to do something fun and exciting, I would encourage you to go to that. It's I believe it's in Dunham Theater, which is right over that direction. Ask anyone on campus, or you can ask me, and we'll give you directions if you need that. I'm going to make my remarks about our keynote speaker today very brief, give him some time and respect to speak for himself. There's a biography for each of our keynotes, and then also a list of the people making commentary afterwards. Again, I'd like to point out at the very beginning of your brochure, the acknowledgments. This is not just a Houston Baptist University event, but it has been composed by some people who have grown very dear to me, and I hope that you will see that filtered through. It's my delight then to introduce Dr. Engelhardt, and with no further ado, I'll give him the mic. Thank you.
Thank you all for the, wow, that's too loud, isn't it? I'm a loud person. Thank you all very much for the chance to be with you all this afternoon. I will, being a boring professor, read a paper. Every now and then, when I get bored with reading through a paper I have obviously myself read through often, I may make a few extemporaneous remarks. You will find, as you listen to the paper, in some sense, I'm both affirming and taking issue with the title given to the conference, because I have eschewed focusing on the notion of the rights of conscientious objection, and taken the much more provocative choice of talking about the obligations of Christians to act as Christians, which has a more objective coinage. I'll begin the paper. In the Eastern rites of the Orthodox Church, during the prosthesis, that is, during the proscomedia, the prayers during the preparation of the bread and wine before liturgy, the priest, when taking out the seventh particle from the leavened bread that will be consecrated during liturgy, prays in honor and memory of the holy, glorious, and wonder-working unmercenary physicians, Cosmos and Damian, Cyrus and John, Ptolemaeon and Hermolaus, and of all the unmercenary healers. The six named who practiced medicine or assisted in the practice of medicine without charging for the care they gave were also martyrs under the Roman Empire. They were killed not just for being Christians. They were killed for being Christians who, in the face of a pagan empire, made it clear to their patients that the only real cure for sickness and death is Christ. They understood that the surrounding pagan culture could seduce Christians, but it could not violate their conscience. Despite a hostile, dominant culture and its requirements, they were totally unashamed and unembarrassed about being fully committed, proselytizing Christians. They were martyred for their determination to practice health care as Christians should practice medicine, namely proclaiming in their practice the good news of the kingdom. We are in a culture with increasingly strong family resemblances to the cultural context of the first 3 centuries of Christianity, though our culture is distinguished in being neo-pagan at best and post-metaphysical, that is, after God at worst. The hostility of the contemporary secular culture towards Christianity is at the root of the growing challenges and obstacles to living as traditional Christians and practicing medicine as traditional Christians should. We find ourselves in a massive collision between two cultures which collision is reflected in the culture wars between the now dominant secular culture and the Christianity that survives in the remnants of Christendom. My goal in this presentation is to provide a geography of these conflicts of culture in order better to understand our contemporary cultural situation and the place of Christian bioethics in our post-Christian world. My particular focus is on why the obligation to God of individual Christians and Christian institutions to refuse to provide or even refer for forms of medical treatment and health care that Christians know to be immoral is such a secular moral outrage. The goal is to appreciate better why the invocation of personal and institutional religious obligation as grounds for not providing interventions such as abortion, in vitro fertilization with embryo transfer for those who are other than men and women joined in marriage, physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, constitutes such a profound moral affront to the partisans of the contemporary dominant secular culture. Traditional Christians must recognize the magnitude and sources of the political incorrectness of the Christian moral and bioethical obligations that require Christians, including Christian healthcare professionals, to act in violation of the secular ethic. In this essay, I will avoid speaking of the rights of conscience or of conscientious objection. Instead, I will identify obligations to God. The deepest evil is not the seduction of individual moral consciences, which is surely evil, but the violation of the will of God. I recognize that in etymology, conscience does indeed derive from the Latin conscio, to know well, or to be conscious of what is wrong. I also recognize that those who in good faith who act wrongly nevertheless commit a sin in ignorance. Misformed conscience, which leads one to do an evil act, even though one thinks one's acting rightly, is still an involuntary sin, a sin of ignorance. In particular, I wish to avoid an appeal to individual rights and instead to talk of individual obligations to God. Last but not least, I shall not refer to Orthodox obligations being located in, or my speaking from, the Orthodox tradition. Nor will I employ truth-deflating phrases such as the Orthodox Christian tradition teaches. In lieu of such theology-deflating, postmodern, post-metaphysical discourse, I will simply speak of what Orthodox Christianity knows. Consider how bizarre, truth-deflating, and out of place it would be if I, as a physician, said, in my tradition, you have type 2 diabetes. It would be bizarre. First, I will explore the great gulf separating traditional Christianity from the contemporary dominant secular culture, so as to show why the secular culture is committed to compelling Christian physicians, healthcare professionals, and healthcare institutions to provide healthcare services that Christians know, or should know, to be immoral. Then I show why moral philosophical reflections cannot offer a common ground that can bridge the gulf between these cultures in conflict. Christianity, as I will then mention, did not have to wait for the bioethics of the late 20th century to have substance for its bioethics, which bioethics was, is, and will remain at odds with the non-traditional Christian, pagan, and secular moral and bioethical visions that surround us. Finally, I will bring these reflections together in a summary of why the secular culture possesses such a strong animus against the refusal of traditional Christians to make available all legally established healthcare services. In this context, it is not correct to suggest that the secular culture seeks to violate the conscience of Christian healthcare professionals. Instead, as in the first 300 years of Christianity, Christians are faced with the need to decide whether they will be confessors of the faith in the face of a hostile secular culture, or whether they will allow themselves to be seduced by that culture. That's the introduction. Now we're made to the second section, so we can wake up for a few minutes. The secular culture's opposition to Christian physicians, healthcare professionals, and healthcare institutions refusing to provide the full, legally established range of medical services can only be adequately appreciated against the background of the foundational conflict between the bioethical commitments of traditional Christians versus the moral and bioethical demands of the now dominant secular culture. Christians are now the odd man out. Traditional Christians live in a post-Christian world, increasingly dominated by secular states that are on their way to becoming secular fundamentalist states. By secular fundamentalist states, I mean a state that at law, in public policy, and by its public mores, establishes a laicist ideology. That is, an ideology aiming at rendering secular the public forum, public institutions, public discourse, and public professions, such as medicine. Secular fundamentalists are those who support such a polity. Among other things, the secular fundamentalist state seeks to render it impossible for Christian physicians, healthcare professionals, hospitals, and other healthcare institutions to be able to refuse to practice medicine and provide health care in accord with anything but the secular ethos, save perhaps in a few limited circumstances. This secular ethos is secured by an emerging web of secular human rights that, through their gravitas, seek to shift the moral burden against traditional Christians by holding that the claims of selfless professionalism and of social justice can require violating obligations to God. If you were reading the paper with me, you'd see a footnote to a recent article by a man by the name of Cantor. In the secular fundamentalist state, there is no separation between state and secular ideology. There is instead an aspiration in a totalizing fashion to define public life and the public professions, including medicine and other healthcare professions, in terms of purported secular obligations so as to force such professionals either to act against their obligations as Christians or to leave their profession. The goal is a form of religious and moral cleansing, the ideological analog of ethnic cleansing, that aspires to remove the presence in the public space of the moral and religious diversity contributed by traditional Christians. Unlike formal right constitutions, such as the American Constitution of 1787, that eschew claims of human equality, human rights, human dignity, and social justice, the secular fundamentalist state is the secular equivalent of a religious fundamentalist state. The secular fundamentalist state seeks to establish its discourse, not only in the public forum, but in the public space, so as to render thoroughgoingly secular the public forum, the public space, the healthcare professionals, and public discourse. Further, and very importantly, the now dominant secular moral vision has succeeded in deflating the moral significance of a range of moral choices that had once been publicly acknowledged as moral choices, rendering them instead merely lifestyle choices, having a quasi-aesthetic value. The deflation of traditional morality renders choices regarding the sex of one's sexual partners, abortion, physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, from being morally significant choices into being merely personal or lifestyle choices, as long as these decisions affirm the equality and liberty of others. That is, as long as secular human dignity and social justice are endorsed. This dramatic shift in the character of the dominant Western morality occurred as Western culture became normatively post-metaphysical, following the cultural death of God in Western culture, which cultural watershed Hegel announced in his 1802 paper Glauben und Wissen, Faith and Knowledge. Without God, there's no longer an anchor in an unconditioned moral perspective. Instead, there is no perspective beyond the socially and historically constructed perspective of particular narratives and their speakers, narrators. All comes to float within the horizon of the finite and the immanent in the space of social historical construction. In other words, all reality is what we make it to be. You can tell that when you've met a truly postmodern person, they will say, well, this is true for me. It may not be true for you. Or that's my narrative, or that's my tradition. Imagine again if I, as a physician, told you, well, in my narrative, you have congestive heart failure, but maybe in your narrative, you have athlete's foot. Who knows? The postmodern shift is to deconstruct moral choices to merely personal choices set within a particular narration. Now, at times, and I was accosting some people here who are not really Texans, I almost think that being a Texan is part of the being of the world, but I know really it's just part of my narrative. The fact that I have Western boots, all of that is a lifestyle, perhaps the best lifestyle. But to reduce morality and religion to lifestyle and tradition is to pervert and change its very significance. Apart from God, by default, each person becomes the ultimate origin of and focus for his own moral concerns. In the absence of canonical standards, each person's freedom becomes equally the determinant of moral propriety, such that decisions among consenting adults emerge as the linchpin of the contemporary secular moral fabric. Each individual comes to be regarded as having a moral right to tell, authenticate, and peacefully realize his own moral narrative, as long as others may do as well. In addition, public professions become regarded as required to aid in not just the protection of the forbearance rights of others, but affirmatively in the realization of the claim rights of others. In this case, in the positive support of the realization of peaceable narratives, as long as those above are allowed to do, allowed the same freedom to do likewise. Forbearance rights are your right for me not to shoot you without your permission. Claim rights is when you want me to give you enough money and food to live whatever lifestyle you want to embrace, perhaps only with good pâté and caviar. Claim rights are those that you make against others for goods and services. What happens is that those who are in the professions are held not just to have forbearance rights, but forbearance duties against others with forbearance rights. But the others can now, since they're public professionals, claim their services in realizing the legally established range of activities to which citizens may enter. It is for this reason that the condemnation by traditional healthcare professionals of some choices and narratives as immoral is regarded by the secular culture as unacceptably intolerant, as constituting an intolerance that the secular culture should not tolerate. This is the case because such moral condemnation is considered to involve a failure to accept others as free and equal sources of moral authority, of personal moral truth. Such intolerance, if voiced publicly, is then construed to be a form of hate speech. The result is a secular morality and bioethics whose content, structure, and orientation arises, which is incompatible with traditional Christianity, not just in its content, but due to its moral deflationary and post-metaphysical agenda. There's a whole bunch of choices that the dominant culture says, those are personal choices. And when a physician says, I will not help you in doing that because it's wrong, that becomes a form of intolerance, because at that point, the physician announces the person may have a right to do what is wrong, but what they're doing is nevertheless wrong. Now, the thought might be we could, through philosophy, find a common ground. Things aren't as bad as I sketched it. I sketched up to now a collision between the dominant secular culture that now shapes most Western polities and the view of Christians. And the view might be, all we need is a few good philosophers, and we could bridge fides et ratio, faith and reason. Now, I show why that hope is ill-founded. One may appropriately attempt to blunt these conflicts by the establishment of a limited, non-secular fundamentalist state as a modus vivendi. Framed through a formal constitution, one might think of political arrangements such as the American Constitution of 1787 and the Texan Constitution of 1845. However, in such a modus vivendi, there is strictly no common moral ground between traditional Christianity and the secular culture. The traditional Christian moral and bioethical vision stands not only in contrast with the morality and bioethics of the dominant secular state, it is also at odds with early second millennium attempts to frame a Christian medical morality whose substance was considered to be independent of a confession of Christ. These latter endeavors, grounded in a robust faith and reason, came to aspire to disclosing norms for right action that could supposedly be rightly known apart from rightly ordered worship. The point is, if you look at the history of the West, part of what the roots of our problem was the attempt to react to the two major bloody religious wars of the 17th century, the Civil War, not the late unpleasantness, but the Civil War in England from 1642 to 1651, and the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, because the West had developed such a faith in reason, that reason could disclose that which faith knew. And because faith in the West led to these bloody wars, the Enlightenment developed the view, well, then let's not talk about faith anymore. Let's just talk about reason. And so the Enlightenment is the hope of being able to have reason bind us together. And the idea was that we don't need to talk about the one God, we can talk about the one reason. The person who introduced me, I asked him to only say one thing about my past, and he failed. I told him to mention that in my youth I was a deputy sheriff in Comal County, Texas. Imagine a bar in, let's say, England in 1275. People here at Houston Baptist surely don't drink, but you know of people who do, and some of those who are Roman Catholics and Orthodox surely do, but never to excess. And so you can imagine, though, those who do to excess doing it in a bar in London in 1275. And a deputy sheriff is sent in and tells the people to hush up. And they say, by what authority do you tell me to hush up? And they said, well, you're just stereotyping me. I studied in Paris under the angelic doctor who died on his way to the Second Council of Leon of most impious memory. So I can tell you why I have the authority of God. Pick up the Bible, read Romans 13th chapter 1 to the 1st to the 4th verse. I carry the sword and not in vain. Besides that, I read Aristotle, and I'll give you an argument about a rector ratio and how that leads to a rector ratio agibulus. And so both by faith and reason, I can establish why I'm here. People shut up and say, that's wonderful. Then imagine going to the same bar in 1690. There, the people are drunk again, and somebody comes in, calls for the sheriff. The sheriff stops the deputy sheriff, says, hush up, you all. And they say, by what authority? Well, if the deputy sheriff brings out his Bible, the Episcopalians, Anglicans, will go against the Presbyterians, and both of them will go after the Roman Catholics and the Jews. So the last thing you want to do is bring out a Bible. And so the deputy sheriff said, well, I studied at Oxford with John Locke. He couldn't make any money in philosophy, so he went into medicine. I couldn't make any money in philosophy, so I went into police work. But let me now walk you through the second treatise on government, and you'll see that part of an ordered society requires someone such as me, the deputy sheriff, to make sure that life and property are secure. You say, heavy, fantastic. Of course, now looking to the next part of the presentation, in a postmodern world, we don't even agree about reason. You come into the bar, you see a lot of people doing different things to each other, and all the sheriff said, is anyone doing anything to a non-consenting adult? And everyone says, no, we're all adults and we're consenting, so okay, goodbye. Okay, so what the hope that came out of the 13th century is you could reason your way through it all. But the problem was, there's no one sense of reason. And then worse than that, the people who argued in that way were committed to misreading the second chapter of Romans, second chapter of Romans from the 10th, about the 16th verse, where the phrase is about the law working in the heart. And if you remember the first chapter, the people who didn't worship correctly had perverse inclinations. And so St. John Chrysostom points out, it doesn't mean that philosophers will be able to reason their way to a natural law. He says, this is St. John Chrysostom in his homily, fifth homily on Romans, but by the Greeks, he, St. Paul, here, means not them that worshipped idols, but them that adored God, that obeyed the laws of nature, that kept strictly all things, save the Jewish observances which contribute to piety, such as was Melchizedek and his, such as was Job, such as were the Ninevites, and such was Cornelius. So the argument is not only philosophers can't do it, but if you go out just by yourself and try to look into your heart and live a perverted life with wrong worship, you'll get everything wrong, just like St. Paul pointed out in the first chapter. It's for that reason that all of traditional Christianity has, as one might say, a real hermeneutic of suspicion against philosophy. I'm a tenured philosopher. I teach philosophy as the history of ideas. But one has to remember the Pauline declaration that God made foolish the wisdom of the world, and even Tertullian of ambivalent memory asked, what does the church have to do with the academy? Or Athens with Jerusalem, and picking up St. Paul's warning, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. So when one looks at the attempt to have a common ground, it doesn't seem that either philosophy can do it by reason alone, or people looking for the natural law that is within them. And so then you get the traditional view of Christianity, of orthodoxy, which is affirmed in the Ninth Ecumenical Council. At the Ninth Ecumenical Council, the fathers say one may be a philosopher to teach the history of ideas or to give erudition and education, but don't think it'll lead you to the truth. And it's in that vein that St. John Chrysostom speaks of Plato, who composed that ridiculous republic. So the idea that we would be able to think our ways to a common ground was never a part of traditional Christianity. Surely something that arises in the West in the 13th century, goes aground on the religious wars of the 17th century, and there we're brought to postmodernity. We made to the fourth section, and I won't read the fourth section. It's one that points out that if you look at the fathers, you'll find in them enough to know everything about bioethics. It's not as if you need Beecham and Childress, much less Engelhardt, in the 1970s and 80s to come up with the content for bioethics. If one reads through the Didache, reads through the writings of St. John Chrysostom, there's even a clear condemnation of cloning, pointing that humans are only supposed to be reproducing male with female, and they don't reproduce like plants. It's not as if you had to wait for Kennedy Institute to give guidance. So we start in the beginning of the 21st century with what's really a full Christian bioethics, but we're at a change in civilization. Now comes section 5. The Christian moral and bioethical vision stands in sharp contrast with the bioethics of the dominant secular culture. We now live after Christendom. 1,700 years ago, on the 28th of October, 312, St. Constantine the Great, equal to the apostles, won the battle at the Milvian Bridge against Marcus Aurelius, Valentius, Maxentius. And then finally, on the 18th of September, 324, St. Constantine defeated Gaius Valerius Licinius at Chrysopolis. It was under the authority of Licinius that the holy 40 martyrs of Sabbath day were martyred on the 9th of March that year. St. Constantine's victories led to the establishment of Christendom, with the consequence that the Christian morality and bioethics of the holy unmercenary physicians became publicly normative and remained so until only a few centuries ago. Christendom was born in the sense that a legal framework came into existence after St. Constantine that was shaped by Christian moral commitments and continued in various forms as the core of the dominant culture of Europe and the Americas into the 18th and mid-20th centuries. This framework has now fallen into ruins. With the 14th of July, 1789, and the French Revolution, and the bloodshed of the numerous other secular revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries, including that of the Bolsheviks, the remnants of Christendom were attacked and broken into shards and pieces. Christians now live, marry, have children, practice medicine, and are patients in the shards and pieces, the ruins of Christendom. It is not simply that they live in the rubble of Christendom, but rather that Christians increasingly live within secular fundamental polities dominated by a robust, pervasive laicist ethos aimed at clearing away even the remaining wreckage of Christendom. The contemporary dominant secular culture is after Christendom. It is bent on removing even the remnants of Christendom from the public forum and Christian discourse from the public space, including the discourse of healthcare professionals. That is, physicians and nurses should give no hint in public if they are Christians. Remember, it's for giving really clear hints in public the holy unmercenary physicians became martyrs, got first-class home to heaven. In this context, living life and practicing medicine as traditional Christianity requires is a countercultural act. The refusal of Christian healthcare professionals to provide to patients who request legally recognized healthcare services, such as donor gametes for third-party reproduction, treatment for sexual dysfunction in homosexual couples, in vitro fertilization and embryo transfer for homosexual couples, abortion, physician-assisted suicide, and euthanasia, can only appear within the contemporary dominant secular culture as outrageous and immoral. As a result, beginning at the end of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century, people began to write articles arguing that it's incompatible being a traditional Christian and being a physician. Julian Savulescu, for example, at Oxford argues, if people are not prepared to offer legally permitted, efficient, and beneficial care to patients because it conflicts with their values, they should not be doctors. The well-known Italian philosopher who has the difficulty of being even 3 years older than I am, argues that gynecologists with a conscientious objection to performing abortion seem to me like policemen with an aversion to carrying firearms. They should find another job. Anyone who's not been reading the literature must realize that there's a great groundswell to purify the discourse of the public forum and not allow people in public professions to say, oh, I'm first a Christian, and then secondly, a physician. We're almost at the end. At this point, I want to summarize the reasons for this deep conflict, this collision. For those who are reading along in a libretto, you're on page 15, the bottom paragraph. One can now appreciate with greater substance why there is such a concern on the part of the secular fundamentalist state and its supporting culture to prohibit Christian physicians, healthcare professionals, and healthcare institutions from refusing to provide legally established healthcare services. First and foremost, refusal on the basis of conscientious objection by Christians to provide legally established healthcare services represents, from the standpoint of the secular fundamentalist state, a failure to recognize the legitimacy of the secular state's claim that the professional services of physicians and other healthcare professionals, and especially the services of healthcare institutions, have been placed within a secular space where the governance of Christian moral and bioethical norms are to be regarded as improper. If refusals were allowed, then a private morality, indeed a religiously ordered morality, would have been permitted to become public and to undermine the priority claimed by the dominant secular morality. There is a special adverse focus on Christian moral and bioethical commitments because the now secular culture is historically and normative after Christendom, after Christianity. Secondly, in addition, from the standpoint of the secular fundamentalist state and its mores, refusals to provide legally established services are regarded as a form of discrimination against others who, within the secular culture, are held to have a justified expectation that legally approved services will be provided on request by state-licensed professionals, such that refusal by those professionals should be regarded as a prohibited limitation of the warranted expectations of others, and therefore as a violation of the autonomy of others and of the claims of social justice. If you all have watched how social justice is often used, it is a term used to devour most traditional views. I have a footnote, which I wish I could read the footnotes. I like the footnote better than the text. Hayek, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, said you can always tell when a clergyman is losing his faith. He begins to talk about social justice, but I won't read that. 3, finally, within the dominant secular culture, refusals to provide customary medical services are regarded as equivalent to a refusal to accept the secular culture's deflation of the moral significance of lifestyle and death-style choices. A deflation that the secular culture seeks to accomplish through treating as matters of private choice peaceable decisions involving sexual preferences, reproductive preferences, and preferences regarding how one wishes to die, including whether to use physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia. The refusal of Christians to provide customary health care services thus becomes a form of intolerance and an improper moralizing by implicitly through an appeal to a claim of a right of conscious objection, publicly condemning as immoral the secular permissible lifestyles or aesthetic styles of others. The point is, what the secular culture wants to do is to tip the balance. So any Christian who refuses to act according to the secular norms is a person who is acting against the established norms of society, who is a person who denies people the legally expected services to which they have a right, and beyond that, who engages in a form of hate speech by telling the other people that their lifestyle choices are perverse and immoral. Consider conflicts about conscience clauses, or better yet, about the right to, or even better yet, about the obligation of conscientious refusal and the obligation to maintain institutional religious integrity for institutions that include physicians and religiously affiliated hospitals from providing immoral services, are but the tip of the iceberg of the conflict. It is a move to transform what had been Christendom into a post-Christian context. Realize what really offends them is when they realize that Christians may not only not provide the services, they may not even refer for them. I was baptized at the age of 50, and it's a good thing. It covers many sins. As a Texan, some people will say, but there's nothing wrong with Bubba that a good killing wouldn't cure. And imagine that I had killed a few people within the bounds of the service of being a deputy sheriff before I was baptized. And then afterwards, someone comes to me and says, Dr. Engelhardt, I found Bubba's son. He needs a good killing. So, hey, I'm a Christian. I don't do killings anymore, but I know someone who will. Now, if I do that, you won't take my Christianity seriously. So if I say, hey, I don't do abortions, but I know a neat abortionist or a person who will help you in physician-assisted suicide, you see, the force of doing a referral is just as bad as engaging in the action itself. We're now to the last section, only one page. The secular insistence that Christians be healthcare professionals and healthcare institutions provide service on terms dictated by the dominant culture will not go away. Traditional Christian and secular moral perspectives are incompatible, and the conflicts will persist. Christians are called to live their lives and practice their professions, looking to a reality beyond the horizon of the finite and the imminent. They are to focus on the pursuit of the kingdom of heaven. In contrast, those who have interiorized the dominant culture live their lives and practice their professions within the horizon of the finite and the imminent. They live and practice their healthcare professions after God, after metaphysics, after Christ. The gulf between the perspectives is profound and unbridgeable. This is not to say that traditional Christians may not be able rhetorically, and surely well advised to try rhetorically, to persuade others of their attraction of, as a modus vivendi, of such formal right constitutions of that in Texas in 1845 and the American Constitution of 1787, such supported limited government through offering mutual advantages, including the mutual recognition of rights of conscientious objection. Such a limited state is not a moral community, but a society encompassing diverse communities with incompatible moralities, within which incompatible moral and ideological views may assert themselves not just in the public space, but even in the public forum. These views regarding the possibility of a non-fundamentalist state are, however, not rooted in the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. They are instead rooted in Anglo-Saxon common law, which produced the notion of the rights of Englishmen, and in views supporting a formal right constitution as a modus vivendi in the face of substantive moral pluralism. Christians should surely try, when possible, to engage political rhetoric to secure as much possible space for their moral integrity, including a space for conscientious objection. However, the dominant secular morality sustains a different constitutional vision, one structured around a vision of moral propriety at odds with Christian morality, Christian bioethics, and the integrity of Christian physicians. The dominant secular culture seeks to shape the public space and public professions through a substantive secular view of human dignity and social justice that would bring Christians to violate their obligations to God. The conflicts will not abate. Thank you very much for your attention. Sir, don't be timid.
All right, we are going to have an opportunity also to ask some questions later during the panel discussion if you look in your program. Right now I'm going to ask the commentators to come up and join me on the stage here. We have Dr. Iltis, Dr. Ugalde, and Dr. Jensen. If you look in the program, you'll see from where they come. And they will be giving a 12 to 15 minute commentary on the paper we just heard. And with no further ado, I'm going to set this here for you. All right, and that's your water. Thank you.
That's a tough act to follow. The history lessons are over. I have few interesting tidbits of history to offer, and lots of small words. So, Dr. Engelhardt described the nature and the implications of a set of very serious circumstances in contemporary culture that pose significant problems for Christian healthcare professionals and institutions, circumstances that can only be described as a culture war. And so that's sort of the theme of what I'd like to address this afternoon. The term culture wars has been used to describe deep, apparently intractable disagreements between groups for years. Deep disagreements on significant moral and social political matters among persons within a particular community and between communities or between groups are not at all new. The culture wars in the United States are evident sort of every time we turn around, read a newspaper, or watch the news, between both traditional Christians and secular thinkers, as well as between traditional Christians and others who identify themselves as Christians. It's very important to underscore and hear a couple of points that he made before I want to suggest an unattractive but realistic way out of this culture war mess. First, we have to understand that at stake in this war is not sort of whether or not I get my way or you get your way, but whether or not one will be allowed to fulfill the will of God or be forced to be martyred in order to fulfill the will of God. Second, traditional Christians are confronted with a culture not only in which many do not share their commitments, so he used the expression of Christians are the odd man out, but they find themselves in a culture committed to compelling all Christians to adopt a particular set of non-Christian values. So it's not simply being a minority, but simply being an unacceptable or intolerable minority. The secular fundamentalist state, Dr. Engelhardt argued, is one that adopts laws and policies that are aimed at establishing a particular public ideology. It is not, contrary to what some may hold, a neutral state or a neutral ideology. We hear that language a lot. The secular is neutral, and I'm going to suggest today that that's false. The culture wars we face are the result of two conditions. I want to spend a little time talking about those two conditions. First, there are deep differences in the commitments individuals and groups within a society hold. That seems fairly obvious. While the culture wars are often characterized as Christians versus others, we should be careful to note that even among groups who identify themselves as Christians, we find radically different views about sexuality, abortion, death, and the family, among other things. For example, while some Christians accept third-party assisted reproduction, even when it involves the use of donor gametes, others recognize this as deeply problematic. Some Christians support physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Others recognize that these practices are deeply immoral. Some who identify themselves as Christian believe that abortion is morally permissible. Some believe it's always impermissible. Some argue that it's permissible when it's utilized under certain circumstances. Consider the depth and the breadth of these differences. Throughout the 1970s, the Roman Catholic position on abortion, which has not changed, was radically different from that of the Southern Baptist Convention. The latter, and I learned this from Dr. Mitchell a number of years ago and was really surprised to learn this. At the time, the Southern Baptist Convention had supported legislation to allow abortion in particular cases such as rape, incest, or severe fetal anomalies. Over time, the Southern Baptist Convention came to hold positions that are now broadly characterized as pro-life and much more in line with the positions held by the Roman Catholic Church. But even among Christians that people often characterize and sort of lump in the conservative group, there are deep differences, and it's important to keep that in mind. Someone who does not recognize the fetus, let alone the embryo, as a possible victim of murder would find these views completely incomprehensible. Similarly, persons whose view of abortion as an important means of treating diseases or disorders by preventing the birth of children afflicted with particular conditions would similarly find these views implausible. One who recognizes abortion as simply a violation of the will of God will find it incomprehensible to speak of abortion as a medical treatment, especially since no other medical treatment besides physician-assisted euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia has as its explicit goal the death of a human being. Even persons who identify themselves as members of the same Christian denomination may disagree with each other. For example, the Roman Catholic Church clearly condemns assisted suicide and euthanasia, yet there are scholars writing in the Roman Catholic tradition who attempt to argue that from within their tradition, euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide are morally acceptable, and that Roman Catholic hospitals may licitly engage in euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. Similarly, there are substantial data suggesting that persons who identify themselves as Roman Catholics often disagree with and ignore the Roman Catholic Church's prescription on the use of contraception. Differences on specific issues in bioethics between traditional Christians and secular thinkers, as well as between traditional Christians and others who identify themselves as Christians, are an effect of holding significantly different moral, metaphysical, epistemological commitments. These commitments are one of the major reasons we see the culture wars. Traditional Christians hold foundational commitments that are at odds, not only with secular commitments, but with many modern interpretations of what it is to be a Christian. Traditional Christians are not ashamed of these commitments, nor do they think that their failure to defend those commitments to non-believers in terms that non-believers can appreciate is problematic. Traditional Christians recognize that the justification of moral commitments through reason alone leads to a regress of assumptions that ultimately are not grounded in reason alone, but rather in specific assumptions or beliefs that people bring to the table when they rely on reason. Traditional Christians also recognize that our commitments are not necessarily provable to all and that they can lead to an infinite regress. However, those commitments lead back to an infinite God. A regress that leads to an infinite transcendent God is welcomed above one that leads to an infinite regress of personal beliefs, inclinations, and biases. These deep divisions cannot be bridged by reason alone. Numerous scholars have attempted to do so, and Dr. Engelhardt went through some of that history. Reliance on reason alone is implausible for a Christian. Even Roman Catholics whose moral theology is rooted in reason acknowledge that it is reason informed by faith. Reason will not solve the culture wars alone. The appropriate role for reason is debated. What counts as reason, what counts as admissible evidence, all of that is disputed. We're left asking how to mediate among different accounts of reason or of what reason discloses, and there is no definitive way to resolve these disputes. Deep disagreement alone, however, is not likely to result in the interactions that we see today that merit the reference to war. If those who disagree stood in isolation of each other, and the deep gulfs between them would be mere sort of observations about the world. We wouldn't see what we now consider to be culture wars. So this leads me to the sort of second condition, the second reason we see the culture wars. When persons or groups attempt to use the coercive power of the state to privilege or impose a particular morality, these deep differences become battles in the public square, and that is when we see the culture war. Depending on their view of the state, some who hold traditional Christian commitments will recognize the limited state as the only justifiable state in a pluralistic society, and the only state that will allow them to remain faithful to their commitments, to maintain their integrity. A limited state will not require traditional Christians to pay for or provide abortions, physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, third-party assisted reproduction using donor gametes, or other interventions that we might find objectionable. Similarly, persons who hold that in a pluralistic society only a limited state is justified will not seek to use the state to require individuals to provide practices or engage in practices that they find unacceptable or know to be immoral, such as physician-assisted suicide, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and so on. They will not seek to require participation in or payment for these services. Those who favor an expansive state, one that uses its coercive force to operationalize or institutionalize a particular set of commitments, will come to a different conclusion. And it's here that the culture wars break out, and it's for this reason that they persist. Persons who seek to use the state to prohibit certain practices and require other practices will find themselves at war with those who either seek to be left alone or seek to use the state to require a different set of practices. The role of the state, combined with the fact of deep moral disagreement, leaves us in the state of the culture wars. It's here that we have differences that take on the character of war. Many secular thinkers appear to believe that as long as what is being universally imposed is not religious, it's not problematic. This is not so. To privilege a particular agenda over others or to coercively impose a particular agenda is to fuel the culture wars, as I've argued elsewhere. To privilege secular moral reasoning as pursued by certain individuals or groups whose non-neutral premises often are undisclosed or unrecognized, and then to privilege particular products of that reasoning is to evade neutrality. Absent efforts by anyone to use the state to enforce or privilege a particular morality, it's less likely that the language of a culture war would be appropriate. We would still have vast moral differences, and those could be a great source of stress among people who seek to coexist. But these differences might not lead to interactions that we characterize as a war. Secular thinkers may hold that their efforts to use the state are different from the efforts of religious thinkers to use the state to enforce a morality. That's often a dynamic that we see in the media, particularly around election times. But none of those approaches is neutral. Anyone who thinks that the imposition of a particular secular morality is neutral and that such a state is neutral is misguided. If, someone might argue, the public square were left completely secular, the culture wars would not persist. It is, they think, religious zealots trying to impose their religious ideas on others that lead to culture wars. What they fail to recognize is that all moral commitments, including their own, are in the end grounded in non-universally accessible and not universally held beliefs. The rejection of God, or even the marginalization of God and his commands, reflect robust commitments that involve particular metaphysical and epistemological commitments. They are not neutral. All discourse requires a foundation, a series of assumptions that generate content. Moral content does not come from nowhere, and to privilege some sources, such as secular reason shaped by particular philosophical traditions, over others, such as Orthodox Jewish insights, is to ignore the fact that all of these positions rely on fundamental assumptions that cannot be definitively defended as a valid starting point for deliberation to those who don't already hold them or accept them. One who knows God exists cannot ignore him. Any attempt to force persons who know God to act as if God did not exist will lead to warfare. A modus vivendi minimal state, as Dr. Engelhardt described, in which there are no public positions on deeply controversial moral matters, reflects a resignation to the reality of intractable moral pluralism. It also recognizes that no one seeks to be coerced. To be clear, such a state is not one that most of us will celebrate. Such a state leaves in place practices that all groups will find, someone among all groups will find objectionable. For a pro-euthanasia advocate, for example, finding that euthanasia is not publicly funded and that healthcare professionals may refuse to provide euthanasia will be deeply problematic. For Christians, it means that they must accept living in a society in which doctors or healthcare professionals are allowed, if they so wish, to kill their patients, though they may not be obligated to kill them. At the same time, Christians living in such a society are allowed to and obligated to pray for the conversion of hearts. Moreover, persons with robust commitments will resist any efforts that allow others' commitments to leak into the public domain and infringe upon them and their children. They will not accept the legitimacy of a contrary morality as a public morality or as a basis for public activity and law. They will insist that there is no shared public morality and resist any effort to expand the state in ways that encroach their morality. In fiercely defending a limited state, they seek to protect their own integrity, and this may be the best that we can do in the face of culture wars, even if it's not to be celebrated.
Well, my response to Dr. Engelhardt's lecture comes from the perspective of having been a registered nurse for almost 34 years. And this response is going to be very practical, not theoretical or theological. 24 of those years spent in nursing were spent practicing as a pediatric nurse practitioner and clinical instructor, and the last 10 years have been spent as a nurse educator and administrator. I always wanted to be a nurse. I remember my father telling me stories about his Aunt Claire, a public health nurse in New York City who never married and devoted her entire life to nursing, and who died of tuberculosis. Growing up, I read everything I could get my hands on that had to do with nursing, from Florence Nightingale to Clara Barton. In time, I came to realize that nursing was my vocation, God calling me to serve those who needed help and care. So I followed in my Aunt Claire's footsteps. I attended and graduated from the University of the Incarnate Word with a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing, where as a student, I participated in clinical experiences at several Christian hospitals. I remember as a student nurse discussing interventions such as elective abortions in my obstetric and maternity course and in several theology courses I took, and learned that I could not be obligated to participate in any intervention I considered immoral. But then a question was raised. What if the woman undergoing an elective abortion began to bleed to death? What was my responsibility in that situation? should we respond? How would I respond? After graduation, I began working on the night shift at the pediatric ICU of the Catholic Hospital, where I had done many of my clinical experiences as a student. I worried a lot about what it would be like to see my first patient die, especially a child. How would I cope? Little did I realize that working in a pediatric ICU, especially during the summer, I would see many children die, primarily from accidents, drowning, pedestrian, auto accidents. I also saw my share of pediatric deaths from terminal illnesses, such as cancer and cystic fibrosis. One such case involved a 6-year-old with cystic fibrosis who was admitted to our unit in critical condition. The parents had been told that nothing more could be done for the child, and they had to decide whether or not to institute extraordinary measures, which in this case was to place the child on a ventilator. I don't remember all the details, but I recall how the parents struggled with this decision and the emotional toll it took on them and on me as we coped with this dilemma. Our HBU School of Nursing faculty and student handbook contains the following statements that guide us as we educate and prepare our nursing students. The Christian values and beliefs about oneself and society guide the clinical judgments of the nurse. Professional values are enduring beliefs that guide practitioners and serve as a framework for professional decisions and actions. These values are the foundation for moral standards of right and wrong, established in accordance with the profession's norms and traditions. To act as Christian moral agents and to advocate on behalf of patients, nurses must be sensitive to ethical issues inherent in healthcare settings and healthcare policies. Nurses and allied health professionals must be able to systematically reason through ethical dilemmas. Through the educational process, students clarify personal and professional values and develop the knowledge, behaviors, judgments, and skills expected of health professionals in ethical practice. As a practice discipline, caring is the fundamental value of health professionals, growing from altruism, which is a concern for the well-being of others. Caring places demands on the character, knowledge, behaviors, judgments, and skills of the nurse. A health professional's first moral obligation is to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ through service as a competent practitioner. The core values of our School of Nursing strive to establish good professional character and behaviors. The acronym We Care is used to represent the values of wisdom, ethics, compassion, accountability, respect, and excellence. Wisdom, meaning the intelligent mix of knowledge, experience, and critical thinking. Ethics, to demonstrate integrity, reliability, and a sincere good intent. Compassion, indicating a demonstration of empathy for others. Accountability, to be answerable for one's own actions and sometimes for the actions of others, like with our students. Respect, meaning to honor and hold in high regard the individual talents, dedication, and worth of others and the system of which we are a part. Excellence, to strive to be the most competent and the finest in everything we do as we continue to improve to meet the needs of those we serve. Now I would like to share with you some thoughts that came from an article in the latest issue of the Journal of Christian Nursing entitled The Place of Dignity in Everyday Ethics by Dr. Donald Omatuna, Senior Lecturer in Ethics, Decision-Making, and Evidence in the School of Nursing at Dublin City University in Ireland. Is euthanasia right or wrong? Do certain types of research violate human dignity? According to Dr. Omatuna, although such issues are certainly important, most of us do not confront them on a daily basis. If we accept the idea that human dignity has an important role in ethics, we can identify whether actions and attitudes affirm or deny human dignity, making ethics very relevant in everyday settings. As healthcare providers, how we respond to daily situations places a responsibility on the interactions we have with patients. These responsibilities are the result of being personal, relational, and spiritual individuals, and focus on the importance of acting with dignity. Omatuna goes on to say, nurses involved in everyday patient care have practical questions about what it means to live with dignity. It can be challenging to describe what makes life dignified, especially in the face of pain and suffering. Most ethical concepts have roots in religious writings, including central issues such as love and justice. Going back to what the image of God meant in biblical times helps us understand its relevance for ethics. As bearers of God's image, humans should remind others of our Creator. As healthcare providers, we can do this with our words, but our actions speak louder. As I get ready to speak or act, I should question whether I am about to image God as He would want. I should treat others in accordance with the dignity and value as images of God. How we treat images of God should reflect the respect we would show God Himself if He were in our presence. Viewed that way, every human should be highly esteemed and treated accordingly. Jesus declared, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with your strength and with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself." The challenge for nurses, especially Christian nurses, is to become aware of ways that we may violate others' dignity and strive to do better. How might common practices be unnecessary intrusions on patients' personal space? Are examinations carried out as modestly as possible? Are discussions about personal details and decisions conducted as privately as possible? The task may seem overwhelming. To continually relate to others in dignity-promoting ways requires extraordinary capabilities. However, as Christian nurses, we should not forget that the Holy Spirit seeks to guide us in our ethical decision-making processes. This is why the spiritual dimension of ethics is so important. I recall caring for an infant born with anencephaly, or absence of the brain. Specifically, the cerebral hemispheres and cerebellum are not there. She only had brainstem, and that allowed her to breathe and her heart to beat, and she was also able to suck and feed. Her parents had been told that she would probably die within 24 hours of her birth, but she lived for over 9 months. We kept her in an incubator in the corner of the newborn nursery, away from all the newborns, and bottle-fed her. Eventually, she could no longer suck and swallow, so we tube-fed her by inserting a tube down her throat to her stomach. When she died, it was determined that she had probably aspirated formula into her lungs after a feeding. I remember how upset the nurse was, who was the last to feed her, as she felt responsible for this infant's death. By now, her parents had long abandoned her, and she was left in the newborn nursery, and that is where she died. We are called to be kind and compassionate, forgiving others because of what Christ has done for us, not what anyone else has done to us. We are to sacrificially bear the burdens of others because this is what Christ did for us. We can only do this if we are firmly grounded in the grace and power of God. In this way, dignity is a religious idea. Thinking ethically about situations has many dimensions. We need to take into account our feelings and our interactions with people. Feelings alert our conscience to something ethical or unethical. Christians also receive spiritual guidance through the Holy Spirit, the Bible, and by association with other Christians. But it can't all be left at the level of feelings. We must move beyond thinking about an issue to action. As we act, further thoughts and feelings will arise about whether dignity is being promoted or diminished. A well-known story that shows dignity in action is the parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke 10:25 through 37. This story has had a significant impact on Western healthcare, as reflected in hospital names and Good Samaritan laws. The story asks the question, who is my neighbor? Which can be interpreted today as, who is a person or which humans have dignity? Nurses have many opportunities to promote dignity to all to whom they provide care. These occasions present themselves in spite of or because of patients' needs and disabilities. Patients can be helped physically, but affirming dignity helps more profoundly. To act with dignity is to find ways to promote the inherent value of whomever we find facing us, a patient, a colleague, a student, or any individual. The challenge and the opportunity are to find ways to do this with everyone around us. Such a task requires insight and power from the Holy Spirit. The Old Testament prophet Micah declared that God has shown us what it means to be good, to act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That is what it means to act with dignity. And finally, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Dr. Omatuna. Although ethics is often thought of in terms of life and death matters, many everyday situations involve ethics. Human dignity, a more recent way of expressing the belief that humans are made in the image of God, from the book of Genesis, captures the notion that all humans are uniquely valuable and ought to be highly esteemed. Nurses have great opportunity to promote or diminish dignity. A Christian holistic approach to ethics, exemplified by the narrative of the Good Samaritan, acknowledges the difficulty of always being ethical and integrates feeling, thinking, acting, and spirituality.
Professor Engelhardt begins his talk by telling us the tenets of the secular fundamentalist state. In the next section, however, we get the impression that the true villain Engelhardt wishes to vanquish is not the secular fundamentalist state, but rather what he deems, quote, early second millennium attempts to frame a Christian medical morality independently of a confession of Christ, close quote. This odd chimera of Christian without Christ, whose villainous character cannot be in doubt, is never identified, and one sorely doubts its existence. It certainly is not the same as what Engelhardt tells us in the next breath, namely, quote, these endeavors came to aspire to disclosing norms for right action that could supposedly be rightly known apart from rightly ordered worship, close quote. These two are not the same. Seeking, on the one hand, to have Christian morality without Christ, and claiming, on the other hand, that certain moral truths can be known apart from Christianity. Engelhardt presents us, by implication at least, with a sharp either-or false dichotomy between Christian morality and a morality of pure reason, devoid of God. Evidently, any attempt to use reason to discover moral truths must fall in the latter camp. We are told that there can be no common ground between traditional Christianity and secular culture. No common ground? That there is little common ground is a matter of simple observation. That there can be no common ground is a bold universal assertion, demanding much justification which Engelhardt does not provide. That this lack of common ground belongs by nature to the very use of reason independent of faith is a yet bolder claim. For Engelhardt, the use of reason as such leads secular culture astray. To be sure, Engelhardt repeatedly qualifies the faulty use of reason as being, quote, apart from right belief, close quote, which must mean, if it is not a vacuous tautology, apart from Christian belief, or again, it is qualified as, quote, apart from right worship, and finally, apart from life rightly lived. These last 2 points presumably refer to Christian worship and a Christian way of life. else, Engelhardt can hardly make his case. For we might be left with a right worship and a rightly lived life apart from Christianity. At any rate, evidently the only proper use of reason is within Christianity. All other uses of reason provide only error. We are told that philosophy, or reason, can disclose no middle ground. Reason is either within Christianity and has valid use, or it is without Christianity and is entirely devoid of merit. Such an account of the failure of reason, I suggest, is rationalist, in that it places all the fault at the feet of reason. Engelhardt's own qualifications, however, point in another direction. Reason fails not on account of its nature as reason. It fails because it falls short of reason. Why might it fall short? The most obvious reason is suggested by both St. Paul and John Chrysostom: ill will. People willfully choose to turn away from reason and to use reason in order to obscure reason. As St. Paul portrays it, quote, "Ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible nature has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator." Despite this willful abandoning of what they knew concerning God, the apostle concludes that, quote, "Though they know God's decree and those who do such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but approve those who practice them." Close quote. Despite their sin, despite their rejection of God, they still know God's decrees. Evidently, their reason is working, grasping some moral truth independently of right worship. Engelhardt quotes Chrysostom's commentary on verse 10 of Romans 2. Engelhardt does not proceed to quote Chrysostom's commentary in the same homily upon verse 15, which reads as follows, that is, St. Paul says, "What the law requires is written in their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse and perhaps excuse them." Close quote. In his commentary, Chrysostom says, quote, "The conscience and reason do suffice in the law's stead. By this, St. Paul showed first that God made man, able to choose virtue and to avoid vice. For that which may be known by God was manifest in them, and they knew what was good and what bad. But in the case of the Jews, besides what has been mentioned, there was the law, and not reason or conscience only. How comes reason to be able to accuse them? He is not any longer speaking of those only who do well, but also of mankind universally. For then our reasoning stands up, some accusing and some excusing." Close quote. Evidently, even the reason of those who do not live rightly is still able to accuse. How? Because it still knows the decrees of God. Such knowledge, of course, provides a rather ineffectual common ground, for although the sinner knows what the law requires, he is not apt to admit his knowledge, perhaps even to himself, willfully confusing himself. Nevertheless, this defect comes not from reason, but from a will or heart set upon evil. Reason by itself still attains the truth. Reason conjoined to the will leads to error. Cannot the Christian take advantage of this common ground? Could he not use reason to reassert the accusation of the sinner's own conscience? Could he not argue with reason, for instance, that abortion is evil? Of course, those of ill will are likely to reject such reasoning, rebelling all the more against the accuser. For this very reason, I suggest, the secular world will brook no dissent. No conscience clause will be admitted. Why? Not because secular thinkers are relying solely upon their reason, rather because they are rebelling against their reason. They will silence the accuser, the Christian doctor or nurse who declare that abortion is evil. The failure here is not reason. The failure is in the will. Nevertheless, if the Christian persists, might he not reach some souls? Might he not so expose the guilty wound of conscience, such as to spark at least the first step of repentance? Can he not use the common ground of conscience, found even in the wicked, to turn some souls toward Christ? We are seeking the source for the failure of reason. Is it by the very nature of the use of reason or on account of something else? We have suggested that sometimes reason fails because of an evil will. The failure cannot be explained through an account of reason. It can be explained only through voluntarism, by acknowledging a perverse will to power, a will to live one's own life despite what reason dictates. How else might reason fail? Presumably through its own weakness. God has created us with reason, a reason that can discover the truth, but this reason is wounded. It is weak and frail. It knows truths, but it mixes in error. The truth is not easy to come by. This failure also is not on account of the nature of reason itself. It is on account of the defect of reason. We should not conclude that every use of reason apart from Christian revelation is doomed to error. Reason can indeed discover the truth, even if this truth is often mixed with confusion. The astounding glories of the pagan world attest to the power of reason. Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, Confucius, the Buddha, the Stoics, Homer, Virgil, and many more reveal the wonders that reason can discover. Have these thinkers not discovered, independently of Christianity, many moral truths? No doubt, they have also made many mistakes. Does truth mixed with error result in no common ground, or does it result in ground fertile for further development? Plato's Republic, ridiculous? Really? Has not Chrysostom gone a bit too far? Reason unaided with grace results in many errors, as the Republic reveals. But even reason aided by grace still falls into error, as Chrysostom reveals in his poor judgment upon the Republic. Is the Republic the gospel? By no means. Does it reveal amazing insights into the nature of man and the way of life lived rightly? Of course it does. Such ground for fertile development, which was available to the early church, is now much attenuated because, as Engelhardt acknowledges, the modern intellectual tradition is not simply reason apart from Christianity. It is reason in rebellion against Christianity. Nevertheless, common ground remains. Some individuals can be led to see at least some truth, and some truth is the beginning of the fullness of truth found in Christ. Engelhardt rightly points out that Christian bioethics finds its principles from the very beginning, having no need to wait for 20th century bioethics. Such principles come from the revelation of Jesus Christ. They are not the outgrowth of reason, but the pure gift of a loving God, wishing to enlighten our darkened minds. Nevertheless, reason has its role to play in Christian bioethics. The principles are present from the beginning. The application of these principles requires reflection. It requires the use of reason upon the truths given through revelation. Furthermore, the presence of principles given independently of reason does not eliminate the possibility that reason might come, of its own accord, to some of these same principles. Yes, we know by revelation that abortion is evil, but can we not argue that taking innocent human life is evil, and that an unborn child is indeed human? Cannot even non-Christians see these principles? Engelhardt says, rightly, that the Christian condemnation of abortion did not depend upon the embryo having a soul, that is, upon the embryo being fully human. Nevertheless, should the embryo become fully human at some point, then the crime becomes murder, a distinct evil from what it would have been before. And if we can show today, by the use of reason, that the embryo from the earliest moments is indeed human, then cannot we persuade even non-Christians that abortion is evil? Can we not use what reason has uncovered through science to bolster the principles of Christian bioethics? This is not mere rhetoric, as Engelhardt recommends at the end of his paper. It is sound argumentation for the truth. Engelhardt seems to leave us only one alternative. We must say to the secular world that abortion is wrong. Why? Because we know it is wrong, because our faith tells us it is wrong. Can we give any reasons? No reasons that you would ever understand. But surely we can give reasons. Non-Christians, even atheists, can be persuaded that abortion is wrong. How? by way of common ground provided by reason. Will most non-Christians be so persuaded? Probably not. Why? For the reasons already indicated. Because of ill will and because of the weakness of reason. We must distinguish then between what reason can accomplish by its very nature and what reason is likely to accomplish, given the hindrances of disordered desires and weakened insight. Can reason by itself attain Christian bioethics? Of course not. And nothing that Engelhardt has said indicates that anyone has ever thought so, although no doubt some such individual might be found. Can reason by itself attain many truths of morality relevant to bioethics? Of course it can. It can, and it often has. It can because God has created each of us with a mind that can discover the truths found within his creation. God did not make reason an instrument of evil, an instrument of error. He made it good, directed towards the truth. Only through perversion and defect is it sidetracked from the truth. What is reason likely to accomplish given its impediments? Some truth and much error. In our own age, when evil intent appears rife and when reason has been for centuries used to attack reason itself, perhaps the likely result is little truth and great error. Nevertheless, little truth remains truth. It is some common ground. No doubt, some have downplayed the obstacles to right reasoning, supposing that reason can quite easily attain to most, if not all, of the moral law. If Engelhardt is simply arguing against these individuals, then so be it. He is right. They have grossly underestimated the weakness of reason, little recognizing what great assistance they themselves have received from their faith. But if these individuals are Engelhardt's target, then he should not deny all common ground. He should claim, rather, that our current culture provides little common ground. Should we expect the common ground provided by reason to convince the secular bioethicists of the need for a conscience clause? I suspect not. However, because reason can provide no common ground. Rather, the obstacle lies outside reason. They rebel against their own reason and cannot endure the Christian who exposes their consciences and condemns their actions. The obstacle lies in the will.